the meeting formally. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Frank, who's done an enormous amount to bring or reintroduce, shall we say, Darwinian ideas to economics and show their power and importance in a number of publications. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Bob. We're looking forward to your talk because it's more particularly on the case for adding Darwin to behavioural economics. Thanks for coming, and over to you.
Thank you, Jeff and Brian, for inviting me to speak to the group. The main point I'm going to try to make today is that behavioral economics, which I think is widely regarded now as the most vibrant subfield in economics over the past 4 decades. That's a field that started at Cornell University, where I spent my entire teaching career. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in 2017 on the strength of his importing ideas from cognitive psychology into economics and showing that they had great utility there. My own view at the time was that those ideas were important, but that we could make even more progress if we incorporated the insights of Charles Darwin into the behavioral economics movement. So far, that hasn't happened to any significant degree. I'm going to continue trying to make that point, and I'll do it again today. Let's advance the slide, if you would, please. So Adam Smith is the target. I think he's an unfair target by and large. The target of market critics is more properly Adam Smith's modern disciples. Smith's invisible hand story was really a very valuable contribution without any question. I think it is justly regarded as the most important idea in economics still. His notion was that self-interested demands would result in a socially efficient allocation. I think it's important to recognize how much more circumspect he was about that than most of the market enthusiasts of today. In describing the behavior of entrepreneurs, for example, he wrote this: he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end that was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. So it wasn't that self-interested demands always led to good results. Smith thought it was remarkable that they often did. His modern enthusiasts are of a very different mind. They think any attempt to intervene in market processes is a grave threat to human welfare. Let's see the next slide. I remind students that Smith's contribution just isn't to be dismissed, as many critics do. If we didn't have markets, we would not have experienced this unbelievably explosion in growth of income per capita that we've seen since Smith's day. Over the millennia, we hovered along at subsistence level, and only with the development of markets and the process described by the invisible hand did we really see the kind of economic progress that we've witnessed in the meantime. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, many people were skeptical of markets. Karl Marx thought that we didn't really get good results at all in the market system. It was a system dominated by powerful actors who had the capacity, which they often exercised, to exploit the weak. And if we look to the literature of his day, there are vivid illustrations where Marx's portrait seemed to be on target. Let's see, Upton Sinclair in the Jungle on the next slide. described conditions in the factories. They were beyond imagination, so bleak were they. Worst of any were the fertilizer men. This is a rendering plant he's describing, and those who served in the cooking rooms. They often fell in the open vats near the level of the floor, and when they were fished out, there was never enough to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Dunham's pure leaf lard. Things were really quite grim. Then on the next slide came the Great Depression. The classical economists said prices and wages are flexible. If we ever get into a downturn, it will quickly right itself. Of course, it did not. The Great Depression lingered until World War II was underway in earnest. On the next slide, we see the New Deal of FDR was a challenge to market fundamentalists. We don't rely on the market to get us where we need to be. We have a whole bevy of federal programs designed to make up for the shortcomings in the market. With the 50s, though, came a revival of market fundamentalism. On the next slide, Milton Friedman and his acolytes at the University of Chicago led the way here. They were extremely skeptical of the efficacy of government intervention. A famous, possibly apocryphal quote attributed to Friedman: if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there'd be a shortage of sand. Government just couldn't do it. They were beset by incentive problems and inefficiencies. If you gave the government a task to do, it would invariably be done less satisfactorily than by the market. On the next slide, we see that the market fundamentalists had some interesting ideas to contribute. The claim had been that customers couldn't choose wisely in the market because they were not in a position to make intelligent quality judgments for themselves. The market fundamentalists pointed out that there emerged quite spontaneously in response to intelligible incentives a series of evaluation groups that would do the quality inspections for the consumer, and those functioned actually reasonably well. Markets were better than the critics think was the basic message that they offered. And I think to this day, the critics of markets don't really appreciate some of the deep strength of the arguments that Friedman offered. On the next slide, consider the arguments that Friedman offered about safety regulation. He complained that if the government makes people buy more safety than they would have chosen to buy in the workplace on their own, they're acting wastefully. And the argument is really quite simple and more powerful than critics seem to realize. It was this: if there's a guardrail we can put on a lathe, and the cost of that guardrail is, let's say, 100 pounds, and the worker values it at 110 pounds, then it will be in the interest of the big business owner and the worker to install it. If the worker values that guardrail at 90 pounds, he will not install it, and neither the worker nor the employer would be better off if he or she did. So Friedman's argument was that if there's a safety device that satisfies the cost-benefit test, the worker and the employer will have every incentive to see that installed. The worker will be willing to pay for it because he values it more than its cost. And if that's not true, it won't be installed, and it shouldn't be installed. There's no such thing as a perfectly safe world. Anyway, I don't think market critics ever tried to meet that argument. They just continued to argue that firms have market power and exploit workers to work under unsafe, inhumane working conditions. This made it into the political arena in time. On the next slide, we see Ronald Reagan was the first major leader, I think, to translate Friedman's insights into a practical political message. The most frightening words in the English language, he said, are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." He railed against welfare queens and bureaucrats very effectively as a political messenger. On the next slide, we see that in your part of the world, that was quickly picked up by Margaret Thatcher. She scored strong points by voicing the same message in the UK. And there was a very serious withdrawal of some of the government interventions on behalf of people who felt they were not faring well under the market system. All the while, though, there were people who were critical of the market. They were chipping away. Perhaps on the next slide, we can see John Kenneth Galbraith. He's perhaps the most widely read of any 20th century economist. In his New Industrial State, published in 1967, he described the traditional sequence. This is the one that Friedman and others advocate for. Firms employ the best available methods to satisfy consumer demands at the lowest possible cost. That's the standard economic message. He said, no, that's not the way it works at all. There's a revised sequence. Firms identify the goods and services that can be produced most easily and cheaply, and then they use Madison Avenue wizardry to persuade consumers to demand those goods. That was certainly persuasive to many. We've seen lots of examples of companies advertising goods that don't seem to make any sense, but are they successful at persuading consumers to buy goods that aren't the ones that best serve their needs? Galbraith was confronted with the example on the next slide of the Edsel. This was perhaps the most heavily advertised product in history when it came out. It was a new model of car introduced by the Ford Motor Company. They spent, in today's dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars promoting it, and yet it was a total flop. Within a year and a half after its introduction, they discontinued production of the Edsel. It was a total failure. People asked Galbraith about that. Well, what about the Edsel, Professor? If they can persuade people to buy any good, why couldn't they persuade them to buy the Edsel? Galbraith's response was that, oh, the Edsel is just the exception that proves the rule. That taps into an interesting linguistic issue. On the next slide, the exception that proves the rule. How does something that doesn't fit the rule you've announced prove the rule? It doesn't prove the rule at all. It contradicts the rule. The expression, it turns out, originated in the earlier English sense of the verb to prove. It's the exception that tests the rule. So in biological terms, the vertebrate species, for the most part, mate polygynously. Males take more than one mate if they can. The exception is in particularly many bird species, the birds pair off early in life and remain bonded to the same partner throughout the duration of their often long lives. If you look at the albatross, one of these birds is a female, the other is a male. You cannot tell the difference between them unless you're a trained ornithologist. And that's because males in monogamous systems don't fight with one another for access to females. So there's no advantage in the males being bigger. On the next slide, I show you Thaler and his inspirations, Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, the Israeli social psychologists. Tversky unfortunately died before he could win the Nobel Prize. He would have shared it with Kahneman in 2001 if he had lived. He unfortunately died in 1995. He was at Stanford by this time, and he would say, my colleagues, they study artificial intelligence. Me, I study natural stupidity. Their paradigm was that even when people have all the information they need to solve what really amount to simple problems, they often make fundamental errors. They use heuristics and shortcuts, rules of thumb to make judgments. And those are efficient in that they save time and they work reasonably well much of the time. But if we put people in the right circumstances, we can predict that they will decide incorrectly. I don't want to, for a moment, suggest that these insights have not been extremely valuable. Richard Thaler has promoted them in the policy arena. There are nudge units, prominently in the UK, but also in other countries, that have employed these insights in order to design government programs that are much more efficient than the ones they replace. So no quarrel here about the usefulness of these psychological insights. My point, and it's the main point I'm trying to make today, is that by themselves, they don't really explain the debate between the great thinkers about the market system, both the proponents of the market system and its critics. The issues at stake in their debates are not really resolved by these psychological insights. So here I'll cite on the next slide, Darwin's Wedge, I call it. Traits are selected largely because of their impact on the reproductive fitness of individuals, not groups. Traits often benefit individuals and groups alike. That's the invisible hand in nature. But often the interests of individuals are squarely in conflict with those of larger groups. So on the next slide, we see an example of the invisible hand in nature. The hawk has unbelievably keen eyesight. It could read the entries on a telephone book, if there is any longer one anywhere, at 100 meters that we couldn't even identify had any entries on it. And how did it get such keen eyesight? Well, there was a mutation that coded for keener resolution in an individual hawk's eye. It caught more prey. It had larger numbers of offspring into which that mutation spread. And over time, those mutations accreted, and now hawks as a species have unbelievably keen eyesight. That's good for the individual hawk. It's good for hawks as a group. That's the invisible hand in nature. In nature, we also see counterexamples. On the next slide, you see the bull elk. They have antlers that are 4 feet across. They weigh upwards of 40 pounds. Why are they so big? It's a classic case of male competition in polygynous species. The bull take more than one mate if they can. The qualifier is important there, because if some succeed at that, that means other males get no mates at all, which is, of course, the ultimate loser slot in the Darwinian scheme. They fought with one another as bitterly as possible to gain access to females, and the antlers were the weaponry in those battles. A mutation that coded for a larger one was more likely, the animal that bore that mutation was more likely to win fights with other males. It passed that mutation on. They accreted, and we're left with these antlers that are incredibly large today in the modern elk. They're good for fighting, but they're terrible in other respects. If these animals are chased into a densely wooded area by predators, they're easily surrounded and killed. If each bull elk could, at the count of 3, press a button that would shrink every bull's antlers by half, that would be a beneficial thing for each animal to do. The fights are decided by relative antler size. Each animal having smaller antlers would mean each animal would be less vulnerable to predation. It would be win-win. Of course, they can't do that. An early critic of mine argued that this is a non-problem, that evolution, if the antlers are too big, evolution can solve that. We just see a mutation coding for smaller antlers. Fine. That completely misses the logic of the argument. Evolution doesn't proceed without limit as these antlers grew in size. We don't see any bull elk with 40-foot racks of antlers weighing 400 pounds. An animal with antlers that big couldn't function at all. There's a limit. This is the limit that's been reached. There's an equilibrium here. If each animal had smaller antlers, that would be better for each animal. But if one animal had smaller antlers, yes, a mutation could code for smaller antlers. But on the next slide, we see that that animal with smaller antlers would never attain. Can we move the slide, please? That animal would never attain alpha status, would never pass the genes for those smaller antlers into the next generation. This is just a simple example of individual interests and collective interests being in conflict. It's not an isolated example. On the next slide, we see the case of trees. They grow taller to get better access to light. But their rivals grow taller too. In the end, we see trees, some of them 300 or 400 feet tall. They get no more access to light than if they were 10 feet tall, all of them. This is a trait that if it grows without limit almost, it's a smart move for one to do that, a dumb move for all. This does not mean that competition is ineffective. This is the wrong message to competition here produces inefficient outcomes, but that doesn't mean competition isn't intense. It doesn't mean that people are colluding. It doesn't mean that the strong are exploiting the weak. It doesn't mean any of those things. Darwin saw clearly the power of competition. On the next slide, consider the power of trees to take root in environments that are extremely inhospitable to trees. They do best, of course, in rich, loamy, well-drained soils, but even on a sheer granite cliff face, they manage to thrive for hundreds of years. As one naturalist described how they do it, in cliffs, roots may follow a lateral crack back into the rock until they find a vertical fissure. They fan out in a plane that will fissure until they encounter another crack going deeper. Filling that crack, they fan out along another fissure, cutting several planes of root mass, which sucks up every available bit of nutrients and moisture in a wide area. This is exactly the process we see in the marketplace. If there's a producer who can best serve a consumer's need, that producer can find that consumer. That consumer can find that producer much better now than in Smith's day, given modern information technology. On the next slide, we see all sorts of circumstances in which individual and group interests are in conflict. So why does an accident in the southbound lanes of a motorway cause hours of delay in the northbound lanes? Tom Schelling observed that when you reach the scene of the accident in the northbound lanes, you have a decision to make. Shall I slow down for 10 or 15 seconds and satisfy my curiosity about what all the commotion is in the opposite lanes, or do I continue at speed? Well, that's an easy question to answer. I'm curious, so of course it's worth 10 seconds to slow down. What I don't consider is that those 10 seconds get added to the trip times of the hundreds or thousands of motorists behind me. If motorists could vote on whether to slow down to get a better look at the accident scene, they would vote a resounding no, each and every one of them. They don't face the choice in that form. This is the kind of choice structure we face over and again in the marketplace. So on the next slide, consider an initial condition in which all cars weigh 2,500 pounds. Someone then buys a car that weighs 8,000 pounds. How does that change the initial situation? Well, the new motorist in his 8,000 pound vehicle is suddenly virtually guaranteed that he won't be killed in a collision with another vehicle. Those small cars simply can't create much damage to his vehicle. Each of them, however, is subject to much greater risk of injury and death. It may be that their best response to his move is to buy a bigger car themselves. And here's the rub. When everybody's driving an 8,000 pound vehicle, each and every one of them are at much greater risk of injury and death than when they had all been driving 2,500 pound vehicles. Smart for one, dumb for all again. Let me move now to the theory section of my talk. I say that with tongue in cheek. There are no equations really in this section. It's really just an inference based on responses to two simple thought experiments. Each one of them presents the subject with a choice between absolute and relative advantage. So in the first one, your own world is about to blow up. You have to move to a new world. You have a choice between world A and world B. In world A, you and your family live in a neighborhood with 4,000 square foot houses. Others live in neighborhoods with 6,000 square foot houses. In world B, you and your family live in a neighborhood with 3,000 square foot houses. Others live in neighborhoods with 2,000 square foot houses. Every other condition in these two worlds is the same. Which would you pick? Well, of course, the neoclassical model, which holds that the utility of any good depends on its absolute qualities. How many square feet does it have? How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? And so on. That model suggests that this choice is a complete no-brainer. Your house would be much bigger in world A, and that's the world you would choose. This question has in fact been put to people in many different environments, and most people don't choose that way. Most people, in fact, choose world B. I would choose world B for reasons I'll explain. But people who choose world A, many of them choose it because they feel they shouldn't care that their house would be bigger than other houses in the other neighborhoods. They might want to choose that, but they feel they shouldn't. Anyway, most people choose world B here, contrary to the predictions of our standard microeconomic models. On the next slide, we see the second thought experiment. Again, it's a choice between absolute and relative advantage. This time the issue is workplace safety. In world A, you have a 2 in 100,000 chance of dying on the job this year. Others have a 1 in 100,000 chance. In world B, you and your family, you have a 4 in 100,000 chance of dying. In other words, twice as likely to be killed on the job in that world. Others, though, have an even worse environment. They have a 6 in 100,000 chance of dying. Which world would you choose? I've put this question to people in many different environments. I have yet to see a single person who says that he or she would choose world B. It's not that they don't notice that they would have a relatively risky job in world A. I think they notice that. But if the only way to get around that problem is to choose world B, where your absolute risk of dying would be twice as great, no one's willing to go there. Following your countrymen on the next slide, I will define housing in this set of examples as a positional good. Fred Hirsch didn't use this specific definition, but it's useful. A positional good is one whose value to consumers depends largely on how it compares with other goods in the same category. Hirsch wrote that the value of my education depends on the education of the man next to me in the job line. Safety is a non-positional good, not because context doesn't matter for how we feel about it, but because it matters relatively less intensely. Positional goods, non-positional goods. Context matters a lot for housing and other positional goods, much less for safety and other non-positional goods. So the theorem, if you want to call it that, on the next slide, is really just an analogy. The right side of the analogy is drawing on the familiar military arms race. Countries face a choice between building armaments, I'm calling those bombs, or building other goods, hospitals, schools, consumer goods. I'm using toasters to stand in for them. According to the standard military arms race narrative, which I don't believe is in any way controversial among people on the left or the right side of the political aisle, we build too many bombs and too few toasters, not because we don't care about how our consumer goods compare with those in other countries. We care about that, but it matters much less how that comparison sorts out than how our comparisons of armament stocks sort out. If they have more bombs than we do, we're at risk of losing our independence. If they have better TVs than we do, that's not a good thing, but we can live with that. Positional goods are like bombs, goods where context matters more than for non-positional goods like toasters. So if you believe that bombs are to toasters as positional goods are to non-positional goods, that's true just by definition here, then you are committed to believing that we will spend too much on bombs and too much on positional goods. We finance our expenditures on bombs by taking resources away from toasters. We finance our expenditures on positional goods by spending too little on non-positional goods. I am eager for somebody to point out any elementary flaw in the logic behind that argument. I hope somebody has something novel to say about that. I've invited that critique on many occasions. I've yet to hear any interesting response to that invitation. On the next slide, we see Galbraith endorsing the conclusion that emerges from that argument. We get a dearth of public goods, the famous quote from his 1955 book, The Affluent Society. He wrote, "The family which takes its mauve and cerise, air-conditioned, power-steered, and powered-brake automobile out for a tour passes through cities that are badly paved, made hideous by litter, blighted buildings, billboards, and posts for wires that have long since been put underground. We starve the public sphere. We spend lavishly in the private sphere." Galbraith said that was because the private producers bombard us with advertisements for private goods and the government doesn't advertise public goods. Well, that may contribute to the problem, but that's not the ultimate source of it. The problem is public goods are non-positional by their nature. We all have the same quantity of them, almost by definition. Positional competition focuses on private goods much more heavily than, and that's why we get too many private goods in the mix of things and too few public goods. Schelling, again, on the next slide, points out why a simple nudge won't do to solve problems like this. His famous example was, why is it that hockey players, when they're permitted to skate without helmets, invariably do so, and yet they will vote, often unanimously, for a rule requiring them to wear helmets? Why, if the helmets are so great, why don't you just wear them? His argument was simple. It was that if you take your helmet off, you can see and hear better, you gain a competitive advantage. The best response of the opposition may be to do the same thing. The equilibrium is one in which nobody skates with helmets, everybody's at greater risk of injury. You can't solve that problem by putting a sign in the locker room saying, "Caution, skating without a helmet may cause serious injury." The competitive imperative to take your helmet off is simply too great. You need a rule in this case. We have rules in other areas. On the next slide, we see the common practice in American athletics. Colleges redshirt their freshmen. They hold them out of competition in their first year. That way they're eligible to compete in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, when they'll be bigger, stronger, more experienced than they would have been if they'd started in the first year. The problem is that when other teams do the same thing, half the teams win on Saturday, half the teams lose. There's no advantage collectively. This practice, though, seeps into other arenas. On the next slide, we see that it had started to seep into the choice of when to send your children to kindergarten. If you hold your kid back a year, he'll be bigger, stronger, smarter than his classmates. He'll be more likely to get into a selective university when he graduates from high school. Other parents can match your move. Then we have, instead of 6-year-old kindergartners, they're 7, then 8, then 9. It stops somewhere. We don't see 25-year-old kindergartens. But why go through that process when we have, as an alternative to adopt a regulation saying that if your child turns 6 by December 1st of a given year, he must start kindergarten that year. On the next slide, we see another example of regulations as data. Are scenes like this common in unregulated urban areas because merchants have bad taste? No, it's that a sign has to be bigger than other signs and brighter and taller, or it won't attract attention. And so we get an equilibrium where the signs look like this mix. Most communities have decided that they prefer the mix we get when we have signs that regulate, or zoning laws that regulate the characteristics of signs. On the next slide, you'll see that one of the key elements in positional arms race is the link between school quality and neighborhood house prices. Every parent wants to send her children to a good school. What's a good school? It's one that's better than other schools in the same area. And in every area I know of, the better schools are located in the more expensive areas. So the rule for a parent is to buy a house in the most expensive neighborhood you can find. And here we go back on the next slide to Milton Friedman's argument about safety regulation. Is it really robbing workers of the right to decide for themselves to build, choose how much safety to buy? Yes, it is, but to object to that on those grounds is like objecting to an arms control agreement, a military arms control agreement, on the grounds that it prevents countries from building as many bombs as they want to buy. That's the whole point of a military arms control agreement. And it's the same with safety regulation. If I'm a worker, since Smith's day, we've known from the theory of compensating differentials, I can get a higher wage if I'm willing to tolerate greater risk on the job. Why might I want to do that? Well, if I do that, I can buy a house in a better school district. The problem is that other parents can do the same thing. We each take riskier jobs. We each get higher pay. As a result, we each use that higher pay to bid for houses in better school districts. And as a result, half of all kids go to bottom half schools, the same as before, and yet each of us is working under less safe working conditions. A safety regulation is a positional arms control agreement, pure and simple. Consider forced savings programs. On the next slide, Milton Friedman said that when the government forces you to participate in the Social Security program, it's robbing you of the freedom to decide for yourself how much to save. Yes, it does exactly that, but consider what would happen if it didn't do that. If you could get your retirement savings out anytime you wanted. Some parents would take them out to bid for a house in a better school district. Others could either leave their savings in their retirement accounts, in which case they would send their own children to inferior schools, or they could match the first family's move, and then we'd have this fruitless bidding war for houses in better school districts. Behavioral economics, if it added Darwin's insights, wouldn't be at a loss for how to explain these kinds of regulations. On the next slide, I'll look ahead. Going forward, we've got lots of important political choices to make. We could, by the choice of suitable legislation, move from our current trajectory, which is I've characterized here in the American context as Society A. We're building bigger houses, spending more on weddings, more on cars, taking less vacation time, spending less on infrastructure and renewables, building too little hospital surge capacity and so on. We could do the opposite of all those things just by taxing people at the top of the income ladder more heavily and using the proceeds to enrich our expenditures in the public and non-positional private spheres accordingly. Every study that's been done on the determinants of human flourishing shows, it's one of the least contentious conclusions that has emerged from that large and otherwise contentious literature, that Society B would have people who lived longer and would be happier all through the life cycle than Society A. A richer behavioral economics would explain more clearly why society B is the better choice than the theories that prevail today. And that's my basic policy message. I'll quickly, in the couple of minutes that remain to me, tackle a question on the next slide that I wish I had tackled much earlier in my career, and it's one that illustrates the value of the cognitive psychology segment of behavioral economics. If my argument is correct, if higher taxes would pay for public investments whose value to the wealthy would exceed their losses from the corresponding declines in private consumptions, why don't they vote accordingly? Why don't they elect politicians who would do that? Why do you get Liz Truss doing just the opposite of that? And I'm going to claim that the answer to that question is that people in general suffer from what I call the mother of all cognitive illusions. First, on the next slide, a word about cognitive illusions generally. Which square is darker, A or B? Since I've called it a cognitive illusion, you're probably suspicious. But if your brain is functioning normally, it will tell you that square A is darker than square B. The two squares, as you might guess, are exactly the same shade of gray. I couldn't believe that when I first heard that claim. I looked at the diagram again and again. I said, the argument makes sense. The argument was that we know B lies in shadow, and we know things that lie in shadow are lighter than they appear to be. And so the brain takes that additional piece of information into account and tells us that B is a lighter shade of gray than A. Yes, that all makes sense. But is it really lighter? Looking at the diagram, I couldn't believe it until I got my graphics program out and drew a strip on the next slide showing that if you join A and B with a strip that's exactly the same shade of gray as both of them, you can't see where the strip starts and ends. They are exactly the same shade of gray. I show you this just to make the point that something can seem unmistakably true even though it's false. That's the nature of cognitive illusions. They don't mean we're stupid. The brain can't process all the information that comes at it. It's got to use shortcuts and rules of thumb, and they work pretty well for the most part, but sometimes they tell us the wrong answer. So now, go to the problem that's confronting the wealthy individual, the government. Frank here proposes to tax him more heavily and finance public investment. On the next slide, how's he going to evaluate that argument? Well, the natural cognitive tool would be to think how you felt the last time his taxes went up. Did that make me feel better? Did I think that was a good thing? The problem with that argument is that as we see on the next slide, the high-income people who are alive today haven't experienced any significant instances where their tax rates went up. In 1966, when I graduated from Georgia Tech, the tax rate was 70%, down from its high of 92% during World War II, and it's fallen steadily in the years since, with very few and only minor exceptions here and there. So we can't use that cognitive heuristic. What do we use in its place? On the next slide, we know that if we have higher tax rates, that will leave us with less disposable income. Will that make us feel bad? Absolutely it will. Of course, we know how we feel when we have less money to spend because we've experienced episodes like that in the past. Next slide, it may be we had a bad business year. We know how we felt then. Next slide, we had a divorce. How'd that feel? We know the answer to that question as well. Next slide, how'd we feel when our house burned down? Yeah, we knew the answer to how we felt. That was not a pleasant experience by any means. Maybe we had a health crisis. On the next slide, we knew how we felt in the wake of that. We felt aggrieved and bewildered in the wake of that experience. Maybe one of our kids got arrested for a serious crime. Maybe we had to hire an expensive lawyer to get him off the hook. We knew how we felt then too. In each of those cases, we had less income to spend, and we felt terrible. So if that's the cognitive heuristic we use to estimate how we'll feel when we face higher tax rates, of course, we're going to resist with all our political influence, and that's exactly what high-income people have done. What people fail to take into account, I argue, is that when these kinds of events happen, the ones I just ran through, they reduce our individual incomes most often, but they have no effect on the incomes of other people in our peer group. And when we think of the process that gives us access to the things we want, we're not worried if we're a high-income individual of losing out on necessities in life. That's not an issue. Nobody's got a plan that threatens that. We're worried about losing out on life's special extras. Well, what are those? Those are the luxuries that everyone wants. They are, each and every one of them, in short supply one way or another. How do you get those? You bid against other people who want them, other people like you who want them. The high bidders get them. And what high-income people seem not to have taken into account is that when their own taxes go up, so do the taxes of other people like them. And so the relative bidding power of people in their set is completely unaffected by higher taxes. On the next slide, the person who wants a massive penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park in New York, there aren't very many sites that command that vista. They're in very intense demand. Who's going to get that site? It's going to be the same person after a tax increase on the wealthy as somebody who would have gotten it before the tax increase. So that's the message. If we would import Darwin into behavioral economics, we would have a much more coherent, logically consistent account of what we're up against. And thank you for your kind attention. I'm sorry the slide drill was not according to plan, but I'm appreciative that Jeff and Bruce were able to handle things satisfactorily.
Oh, thanks a lot, Bob. The slides were fine. They were very clear and moved along perfectly. So thanks for the fantastic talk. We have about 40 minutes for questions and other contributions. Do I see anybody with a hand up? Please put your hand up virtually. Brian Smith?
Bob, would you consider running for Prime Minister?
There'll be periodic openings, I gather.
Well, I'm sure we can create one. No,
that's a good question.
Excellent talk. Thank you, Bob.
No, it's been a source of ongoing frustration and disappointment to me that I haven't been able to persuade anybody in the political arena with the power to do anything about this to take action along these lines. Progressive consumption tax is the remedy I propose. It would make each and every person better off. It's hard to find policies that would be better for everybody, but I agree that that's one.
That's very interesting. Peter Merman. Peter?
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. I actually didn't know that you were toying with Darwinian ideas because I read you on this luck versus skill dichotomy, and so I was very pleased to see you also think about that. But I didn't quite get, what is the Darwinian connection? Is it that there's oftentimes a conflict between self-interest and group outcome, and you are porting that to economics, or what exactly is the Darwinian?
That's the key idea, that Smith's modern disciples say that individual interest promotes society's interest. And in fact, it often does. That's a contribution. I don't mean to diminish Smith's insight about that. He explained that idea more clearly than anyone had done before him. But it's the Darwinian notion that the competition occurs at the individual level, and what happens at the group level is much weaker. There's now discussion about how much weaker, but but certainly much, much weaker is Darwin's message. And so smart for one, dumb for all is the basic insight from Darwin. I call it Darwin's wedge that I'm trying to import.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Bob, I've got a question. How does your argument relate to group selection theory?
You know, when I was first writing about these issues, group selection theory was in bad odor amongst most of the biologists I respected. That's changed gradually over time. I think it's now clear that selection takes place at multiple levels. And so people like David Sloan Wilson would regard the legislative steps we take, kindergarten start dates, for example, to be an example of group selection. So yeah, it's a very general concept. The interests of the group are always threatened by competition from lower levels, and often there are steps the group can take to protect its own interests from that competition.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a question? Roger. Roger Copple.
Yes, hi, here I am. How you doing? I just wonder, I may have missed it. I had some distractions over here, but I didn't see anything in your talk, and I don't recall you in general engaging the issue of how these policies get implemented and you know, how they get implemented in the state. So, for example, I saw you had the thing, the hospital capacity, surge capacity. Yeah, that's a, you know, if you didn't know that was a big deal in 2019, you knew it by 2022. So, you know, yes to that. But for example, that's a good example, I think. The state is going to have a rational, quote unquote, rational administration of the healthcare system. So it's going to, you know, do things like assuming a normal distribution, an ergodic process, stuff like that. Otherwise, it can't defend the excess surge capacity that it's building in. Whereas, just like we need to have a bigger reservoir for the Nile, you know, than ergodic thinking would suggest, we need more surge capacity than ergodic thinking would suggest. But there's a political process, right? And the politicians have to be defend their views as rational, and our current sort of rational models don't allow for this kind of thing as much as they should. Moreover, the political actors who would be implementing these policies are, like you and me, apes. And so they'll behave in an apish manner. So they like dominance and so on. And I haven't seen that enter into your policy analysis. I think those are reasons to be pessimistic about the consequences of any serious attempt to implement the sort of policy you propose.
I'm guessing that your technical difficulties were at the end of my talk when I did talk about exactly why we haven't implemented the proposals that I've recommended. It's that people think they'd be made worse off if they had to pay higher taxes. They imagine vividly.
Well, I'm sorry, you're here addressing the mentality of the electorate.
Yes.
I was more interested in the political actors who might be implementing such policies.
Oh, the political actors follow the will of the electorate, or what they construe to be the will of the electorate.
That's not a universally shared theory of political process.
Well, we adopted the Social Security system in Franklin Roosevelt's term because he felt it would be good politics to offer retirement coverage to people who lacked it. And it did prove popular. Attempts to cut it in the years since then have proved extremely unpopular. If your point is that the political process isn't perfect, I endorse that, of course. if it's that the politicians don't pay attention to the will of the people at all, I would reject that view.
Peter, do you want to come back?
Yes, if nobody else wants to go, I let other people go first before I ask my second question. If no other person is asking,
No other person hand up.
Just me?
Just you, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Bob, one other question I have is, when I read as a doctoral student Schelling's book, I think the title was Micromotive and Macro Behavior, right? He was making very similar arguments than you've been making. And my question to you is, by invoking Darwin, right, what are you getting that you are not getting if you never ever mention Darwin? Because it seems to me, even when I listened to you, and I was reminded, I stood a bit of economics, of course. I was again marveled by that equilibrium thinking sometimes actually works very well, right? So it seems to me a lot of equilibrium thinking is making that point, right? That you want to ask yourself not what is initially the intention, but when everybody is reacting to what the first person did, or game theory also, right? So my question is why? What is Darwin getting you that you're not getting by simply sticking to tradition or economics?
It's not getting me anything at all.
Okay.
I think your point is correct. Well, you could say, where did the game theorists acquire the intuition that things might not work out for the best when people did what they wanted to do? Maybe just by observing the natural world, they got that, and that's how Darwin got it, by observing. So, who knows where ideas come from? But no, if you take as given the insights of the game theorists, the notion that what's in the individual's interests is often not in the interests of people collectively is all there. I wouldn't need anything more than that.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone called Carabelli. Is that Anna?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Yeah, yes. My question is the following: what about the fallacy of composition Keynes explained? You didn't refer to Keynes at all, but the concept of a conflict between the individual interest and interest of the economy as a whole is present in Keynes.
Yes, that's right. It's the same idea again. And I took 1 minute longer than I should have with my talk. I could have put that in too, but we pick and choose in telling stories what to include and what not to include. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's certainly there in Keynes.
Yes. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Angus Armstrong.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. I have 2 points. First of all, just as a sort of fellow Scot to Mr. Smith, the sort of view of self-interest. His word is actually own interest, which of course is different. And own interest in the context of his wider writings can mean something very different to just my own self-interest. And so the idea that we just don't think about the rest and how other people might think of our actions, I think is, you did say this was a simplification, so I accept that. In response to your question from Peter, what does Darwin get you? Where I thought you were going to go is that the sort of typical economic system, it's all about the solution concept. So the solution concept in economics is equilibrium. And it's because equilibrium is tied to the welfare theorems that it's the perfect equilibrium, it's the best outcome you can get. Whereas Darwin is not obvious that he is an equilibrium theorist, that actually has disequilibrium. He has outcomes that are not welfare optimizing. And that's where I thought you were going. But you seem to pull back at it right at the end, saying this is Darwin will take us, looking at this Darwinian way, will take us to solutions that are not socially optimal, which is where I thought you would end up, but then you seem to pull back. Can you just comment on that, please?
I don't think I pulled back. No, I think just as we see stable situations in nature in which the outcome is not best from the perspective of a suitably defined larger group. We see stable situations like that in human society equally. So the bull elephant seal weighs as much as a Lincoln Navigator sport utility vehicle. It's 23 feet long, weighs 6,000 pounds. The cow weighs 1,200 pounds. And that's just because the bulls fight with one another on the beach for 5 hours to see who gets access to the cows. That's not optimal for the bulls. They die younger. They have arthritis. They're unable to escape from the great white shark nearly as well as they could if they weighed a third as much. It's a terrible. You got to really work hard to attain and maintain that body mass. It would be much better for all of them if they were lighter, but that's a stable equilibrium in Darwin.
Yeah, but I guess the point I'm getting at is that Darwin, that stable equilibrium is not socially optimal.
No.
So in answer to Peter's question of what are you getting from Darwin, I can suggest that what you're getting is a different solution concept, which is fairly important because all of economics is based on equilibrium. All of decent economics is based on equilibrium. So that is a major difference.
It's an equilibrium does not mean the same thing as it's an optimum.
Well, in neoclassical economics.
No, well, many neoclassical economists seem to think so, but it doesn't mean that.
Okay, in general equilibrium it does, okay? The two are synonymous.
There are conditions under which it does. But those conditions, if not satisfied, don't imply that an equilibrium is an optimum.
But then you don't have a general equilibrium.
Well, you can have multiple equilibria.
Yes, yes, you do. If you don't have the presence of externalities and being a price taker are conditions for the Walrasian equilibrium to be Pareto efficient. And if those are not satisfied, it's just not Pareto efficient.
And it's not about raising equilibrium.
It is a Walrasian equilibrium. It's just that the externalities are not taken into account by the individuals.
All the examples that I talked about are ones in which there was an externality of one kind or another. You know, so holding my kid back from kindergarten for a year makes other kids less likely to get into the college of their choice. Fielding a car with a bigger engine displacement makes other contestants less likely to win the race. That's why we have limits on engine displacement in Formula One.
Okay, Kevin.
Hey, Bob, thanks for the great talk. And
Hi, Kevin.
I just want to follow up on a question that Peter asked to scratch that surface a little bit more. So I can understand, and probably everyone here can understand and appreciate that this evolutionary framework helps you think about these things and presumably is generative. But probably a lot of us on the call have encountered anonymous peer reviewers who basically have Peter's question, but more critical and aggressive, which is saying that it's parsimonious that it's just flourish to talk about evolution and Darwin, and so get rid of that from your paper because it's parsimonious to get rid of it because, like you just said, Bob, you could imaginably think about a lot of these problems without an evolutionary framework. So I just wanted to scratch that surface a little bit more and see if you had any thoughts, advice on dealing with those anonymous peer reviewers.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. When I first started thinking about this, this was when I first started writing about it anyway. I guess I'd been thinking about it for longer. It was during the 1980s, and at Cornell, you weren't there then, but you may have learned somehow that Darwin was an extremely bad odor amongst many academics at Cornell. If you just mentioned anything related to Darwin, immediately people closed their minds to to any discussion. So you may well be right that it's a strategic error to incorporate Darwin into the narrative in any way. I incorporated because that's how my own thinking was shaped about these issues. But yeah, I don't pretend to have any rebuttal to somebody who would claim that it would be more effective not to invoke him.
Thanks. Yeah, and I wasn't.
He's less in bad odor now than he used to be.
All right. Thanks.
At least in some quarters. Jan Willem. Peter, can you turn your camera off, please? Thank you.
I think my mic's working now. Huh? Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I recognize most of it from your book. I may have one suggestion how the Darwinian angle could maybe be brought closer together with your story, and it's the following. I think in some sense what you're talking about in general terms is about what happens when people become interdependent. Yeah. So in the traditional models, and my colleague from the university in Amsterdam here, Matthijs, was sort of intervening about the Walrasian equilibria there. But in those sorts of models, the conditions under which they work basically require that all the agents are independent.
Yes.
And they're sort of reacting to an impersonal price signal. And the Darwinian story, I think, if you think about evolution and evolution in general, and certainly evolution of human people in particular, at some point we developed a more interdependent way of surviving. And I think part of that story is told by the modern versions of group selection theory. So what David Sloan Wilson and people like that would call multi-level selection theory, which somehow plays into your story. Although, in my sense, not quite all of the group selection part is there, but it plays into your story in the sense of those people who are competing within the group in a positional way that you're talking about are always going to do better, yeah, within the group, but at the level of the group that is doing less of that is going to do better in competition with other groups. And I don't think that
not only in competition with other groups, but for every individual member.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's very clear that your part of your story, your argument is focused on that, what you just said.
Yeah.
But there's the other part of the multi-level selection story, which is about these groups doing better in relation to other groups if they can suppress the selfish, competitively selfish way of behaving. And I think how that was done evolutionarily is through social and moral psychology. And then I think the story really becomes interesting, because then there is your story about, is it absolute utility versus relative utility? Yeah, which is, I think, largely where your Darwinian nomer comes from. But there is on top of that something about understanding our social and moral psychology that makes us stay away from that sort of positional competition within the group, that makes us maybe, as a group, be able to impose norms on the people that are trying to do that, and we beat them down.
Yeah.
And I think if we can bring that part of the story in, then we have a full evolutionary Darwinian type of story, of which your story is a very important part, but the maybe even more important part is the moral and social part.
Yeah, I'm actually quite focused on the point you're making. For many years, I taught a seminar called Rivalry and Cooperation, and that's the great minefield that people have to navigate. And this in response to Kevin's question, I think Darwin's principal insight that affected me was that life is graded on the curve. It's not how smart you are, how fast you are, how strong you are. It's how those traits compare with close rivals that really matters in the Darwinian way of thinking. So identifying the dimensions of competition that give rise to the most costly of these arms races. I think I got directly from Darwin in that way. But the rivalry and cooperation is, you know, to succeed, you've got to do better than others who are competing for the same rewards that you are. But you can't succeed very well in most arenas as an individual. You've got to be part of a very high functioning team. And to be attractive as a member of a team like that, you can't care only about how well you do. The high functioning teams have enormous power to select their members. Everybody wants to be on a team like that. And if they think you're going to steal credit when credit isn't due, or walk off with secrets and start your own company, they don't want you in that group. So you've got to somehow you have to embrace the interests of others. At the same time, you care about how you do relative to the people you're competing with. And that's a very complex set of tasks to manage, but that's the essence of it. Yeah, so I think that I take that to have been essentially your point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Matthias. Matthias van Wielen.
Yes. So have you ever met some rich dude who said, yes, I'm convinced by your argument, because if we tax everyone, I'm going to get my fancy shit for cheaper?
Oh, there are plenty of rich people who back this. Yeah, no, it's just not a majority. We need more. But no, there's a group in the U.S. Called Millionaires for Tax Justice. Maybe that's not the exact name, but it's a name like that. And they lobby as hard as they're able for a more progressive tax system.
But do they do it out of the goodness of their heart? Because this is almost a selfish argument, right?
Yeah, I had an interesting long argument with Robert Putnam. He's a political scientist at Harvard. He thought that you couldn't get anybody to do anything in the public arena except that it would be a moral imperative to do it. I thought it was a good. I told him I thought it was a good idea if you could frame it as a moral imperative to do it, but that if people thought it would be useful for them personally to do it, that wouldn't help. I mean, that wouldn't hurt. It would help, but he didn't agree. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. Maybe if one of my earlier books was Passions Within Reason, whose theme was that if people could recognize that you were a trustworthy person, you wouldn't cheat even if no one was looking. That would be in your interest, because then you would be chosen preferentially as a trading partner in issues that required trust. I received complaints saying that trustworthiness is not about getting ahead, that I was corrupting the idea of trustworthiness. My best response was that, well, if that's why you were trustworthy, was to get ahead, then you wouldn't seem trustworthy to others. It had to be real, or people wouldn't perceive in you that quality. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it.
Okay, thank you. Jan Willem, do you want to come back?
Yeah, just quickly on the last point, there's a Darwinian angle there.
Yeah.
There's a Darwinian angle there in terms of sexual selection theory, which is about sexual selection theory has two parts in biology. I'm not a biologist, but there is the part about the bulls with their antlers fighting for the female, but there is also the other half of sexual selection is the female choice argument. Yes. With the honest signaling and things like that. So there is a Darwinian link to honest signals there.
Yeah, I drew heavily on Darwin in Passions Within Reason. I mean, his 1872 book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, we could somehow tell what's going on inside the brain from neural circuitry that's linked involuntarily to things we can observe in the body. So yeah, if it were easy to fake that you were trustworthy, then being trustworthy couldn't be advantageous to you. That's the worst thing, to be trustworthy and nobody knows you're trustworthy. Then you don't cheat when you have a chance to cheat when no one's looking, but nobody gives you that chance. And
in that sense, there's maybe even a link to what apparently Robert Putnam told you about the moral claim as opposed to the selfish claim. There is something, I think, really fundamental in our how our psychology works there.
Yeah.
And then
which is also in Darwin, isn't it? It's very clear in Descent of Man about the importance of morality, which actually he got from Adam Smith to some degree.
Yeah.
In the moral sentiments.
Well, great
comments.
Yeah, thank you all for these.
Yeah. Peter Merman, do you want to come back?
Yeah, if nobody raised their hand, I have one other question. So as a bit of autobiographical context, so I grew up in Germany, and then I spent 20 years in the United States, and then I spent 12 and a half years in Australia, and now I'm in Switzerland. And these countries have very different tax rates. And Bob, when I've been asking myself, why, has there been such a push to lower taxes in the period that you showed, right? Going from 90 down, why haven't tax rates gone down dramatically in Germany or in Denmark or in Sweden? It seems to me that when you do these cross-country comparisons, right, I think what becomes quite clear is that these social systems, called nations, have histories, right? And there, to me, is the connection. Clearly you can say in economics, you have economic history, or you have, in the last 3 decades, the argument of path dependencies, but clearly a lot of the things about these societies you can explain through a historical process that makes it much harder to raise taxes, in the United States or in Britain compared to some of the Nordic countries. And I just wanted to get your reaction to, have you, when you give your talk in countries which are not so focused, or let me say one last thing, it seems to me that the US in terms of culture is a lot more individualistic to start with, which makes it the illusion that you were referring to become a lot more salient, right? And I also think, and you probably didn't have time, but the other arguments you make in your Luck versus Skill book is, right, that if I'm asking myself, how come, I'm always fascinated by people who are not that rich and still voting for Republicans and low taxes, right? That's the interesting thing to explain. And the way observationally I explain this is because they are, to some extent, afraid that, and this is, I would say, quite a cogent argument, that if everybody is, can get a lot of stuff by not working, are we going to have a society which is producing the goods and services, right? So it's almost like competition is good in a sense that you alluded to in your first place. And so then they would say is, I am against higher tax because it will pay for social welfare and it will make people lazy. And I'm always surprised when people say this, right, who are themselves not very rich. I actually find that a lot of rich people, and I think the statistics show this, right, there's not a 1.0 correlation between your income and your position on how much taxes that should be paid. So I just want to get your reactions. Yeah.
I think the Darwinian message is that you want to get ahead, and getting ahead has any cogent meaning only in the sense of getting ahead in relative terms. I mean, we know that when in the 18th century, wages were a tiny fraction of what they are now. People worked very hard. People in the 21st century work very hard. Wages are much, much higher. If you want to get ahead, that means getting ahead of the other guy, and whether that tax rate is high or low, what it takes to do that is essentially the same. So there's that. This is a story mainly about externalities, the one I'm telling, in all the different dimensions. And I think you're right that the cultural history has a great deal to say about that. Europe is very old. Europe has been settled intensively for thousands of years, longer than the US, or 1,000 years anyway. In the US, until relatively recently, if you bumped into your neighbors, the solution was move west, where there wouldn't be any neighbors. You could do what you want. And I think the idea that you should be free to do whatever you want is a direct consequence of that recent history in the US, which in Europe, you've been bumping into each other for centuries, and the idea that you need to take some actions in order to blunt the consequences of those injuries is much more palatable in light of that history than it would be here. So I think that's the best thinking I can offer in response to that specific question. But yeah, I agree, it's a very interesting question.
Okay, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank Bob for a very stimulating talk and discussion. So a sort of virtual show of hands from everyone. Thanks very much, Bob. It was really fantastic. One of the great things about your talk is it has immediate policy implications. We all worried about the difficulty of getting such a policy effort on the road, but it's very good to hear a direct policy outcome here, which we can see in your writings and elsewhere, which connects evolutionary and Darwinian theory on the one hand with some kind of policy outcome. And I think the discussion about the consumption tax is very useful to have, and also the other discussion about why politicians don't immediately see the benefit of this. So it's been great and very stimulating, and I think it's been a fantastic seminar. Thanks very much for coming.
And thank you, Jeff, and especially thanks to everyone for the thoughtful and interesting comments. Yeah, I really enjoyed them.